Welcome to another episode of The Emerging Point, where social justice meets social solutions, the official podcast of the Center for Social Solutions. My name is Earl Lewis, and I am pleased to be your host. Today, we'll be discussing reparation plans at various levels of government, taking a look at Washtenaw County's recent establishment of an advisory council on reparations as a case study. Joining us today is Advisory Council member and Washtenaw County Racial Equity Officer, Alize Asberry Payne. Alize Asberry Payne is an equity and strategy professional working in Southeast Michigan. Originally from San Francisco, Asberry Payne now serves as the first racial equity officer for Washtenaw County. She brings a community-centered passion and professionalism to equity work, incorporating her experience as a community organizer, consultant, and strategist. We go back to 2020. It served as a crucial turning point in U.S. discussions on race and racial justice, particularly after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Surveys conducted in the wake of the events of the summer of 2020 found increased support for racial justice movements like Black Lives Matter and reparations. While federal reparations legislation has languished in Congress for decades, a number of state and municipal governments have taken action on reparations through their own initiatives. One such municipality is Michigan's Washtenaw County, which established the Advisory Council on Reparations in January of 2023. The council's goal is, quote, to advise the Board of Commissioners and the public on the development of a Washtenaw Reparation Plan, end of quote, specifically aimed at aiding Washtenaw's Black community. Today's conversation will delve into Washtenaw County's reparation work, identifying actionable policy and advocacy steps in pursuit of justice and repair for historical harms across the county. Alize, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Lewis.
Your work on reparations in Washtenaw County actually began with an exploratory committee on reparations. Can you walk us through that committee's process and then its findings and how that evolved into the Advisory Council on Reparations?
Sure. So in 2020, when the world shifted, the global pandemic, one of the things that my office was tasked with was helping to drive the equity response at the local level in Washtenaw County, and providing support to communities as we navigated the pandemic. As part of that process, we did an initial needs assessment and research study in the areas that we saw hardest hit with the pandemic. And hindsight is 2020, and we know now that communities that were already dealing with disparity were the ones that were also really experiencing the worst of the first wave of the pandemic. Through that initial study, what we determined at the county level was that for community members, for Black community members, we were seeing impacts that were not just about health. The things that are broadly defined as the social determinants of health were creating these impacts that were beyond physical health. So households that were already income or resource limited, that were already dealing with substandard housing, that were already dealing with disproportionate representation in positions that would be called frontline first responder positions, not just in the health fields, but also in things like gas stations and grocery stores, our delivery drivers. All of these kind of social conditions that put Black communities, Black residents at higher risk of negative health outcomes, but also the secondary outcomes that we saw with the pandemic related to education, economic impact. When we started diving deeply into how we could help our community navigate the pandemic, prepare for recovery and resiliency, because that was always part of the initial discussion. We were weathering the crisis and knowing that eventually the end would come and it would be time to rebuild, looking at uh, the social conditions, we started seeing trends very early on. All of the things that created disparate impact in Black communities and Black households in Washtenaw County were things that were generational in terms of their existence and their impact. So, housing conditions, um, economic resources, the inability to weather a $400 unexpected emergency expense, all of these kinds of things. When we looked at them, we saw generations of disparity. We saw a community that was dealing with all of the negative impacts of mass incarceration. And before that, redlining. And before that, Jim Crow. And before that, Black codes. And the further back we went, um, the more it became clear that these disparate impacts were as a result of the legacy of American chattel slavery. Because of that, fairly early on, we started having this conversation around, from the lens of resiliency, from the lens of rebuilding in community, what did we need to do to address the disparate impacts? What did we need to do to address the conditions that had put people at higher risk for negative outcomes of the pandemic, which put our whole community at higher risk for negative outcomes for the pandemic? Because of that framing, um, out of that framing, I would say, the Exploratory Committee on Reparations was formed.
That's wonderful. And I actually want to come back to a series of the points that you raised. But before doing that, I think our listeners would benefit from knowing your own personal journey. I said in the introduction that you had made your way from San Francisco and the Bay Area to Michigan and Southeast Michigan. It's, I believe I'm correct. You're the first racial equity officer for Washtenaw County. Tell me how you end up finding yourself in that role.
A lifetime of work, which, that's the thing about doing good work, is that it creates opportunity to do more good work. um, so my father uh, is originally from Michigan, born and raised in Detroit, actually. And my family on my father's side has been in Michigan for several generations. I'm the product of an interracial marriage. My mom was born and raised in the Deep South in Texas. And when they met and married, it was just about a generation after Loving v. Virginia. So it has always been the the intersections of race, social responsibility, social justice were spaces that were part and parcel for my household. The first conversation I had that I can remember having with my parents around racism and white supremacy and the responsibility to make the world better, I was still in elementary school. It has always been part of who I am and how I was raised, and I credit my parents for that. I also would say that growing up in San Francisco, I had the benefit of living in a place where you have a lot of people who are coming from a lot of different kinds of worldviews, and a lot of folks who are first generation um, immigrant families who are there. And that exposure and that experience early on um, put me into spaces where I had a clear sense of my responsibility, my engagement as a member of the global, right, of the world as a whole. And San Francisco, when I was growing up, had a deep culture around social justice, organizing, and activism. I started engaging in activism and organizing spaces when I was in middle school, and I was participating in state level organizing campaigns when I was 13 years old, working around and fighting against the criminalization of young people and fighting for schools, not jails. So that was the space, and that's that I was raised in and I came from. That's been my career. I've had the benefit of working in policy and organizing spaces at the regional and national and international level. When I moved to Michigan, I initially was working in a space around electoral politics. I was a senior and lead organizer for a community benefits campaign in Detroit, and so that was my entry into Michigan. When the opportunity here in Washtenaw County presented itself, it felt like such a deep intersection between all of the different kinds of spaces and work that I'd been involved in my not just my entire professional or adult life, but my entire life period. And the opportunity to come and work in Washtenaw County and really build this work here from the ground up was something that I could not have estimated the challenges, but also the deep possibility. So the journey to Michigan was an interesting one, but this is who I am.
Well, we're delighted that you're here and engaged in this work. Talking about the work of both racial equity and reparations, some critics will argue that reparations really is not to be solved at the municipal or state level, but at the federal level. How do you respond to those critics?
I think that that's kind of like arguing about, what fire department you're waiting on to put out a house fire. It's whoever shows up first does the work. Do I feel like reparations needs to happen at the federal level? Absolutely. It should happen at the state level. It should happen at our county level and our municipal levels. It should happen at our kitchen tables. It should happen at our block clubs and our book clubs and in our neighborhoods. This is work that America as a whole should be engaged in. And I would also argue that this is work that is not just about what happens in America. This is part of a global conversation and reckoning around reparations. I think that this is work that we all should be engaged in, and that there is no space that is too small to have this conversation.
Talking about spaces and places reminds me that you mentioned a few minutes ago that you and those working on the advisory council have learned from the past. And so, in looking at other examples, other municipalities, perhaps Evanston or Asheville or some others, what one or two or three things have you taken away from other efforts at local reparation initiatives that you believe will be guiding the work that you're undertaking here in Washtenaw County?
I think a key lesson is that you can only move as fast as the speed of community if you want genuine and authentic engagement. The other part of that is that government has a responsibility as a institutional partner to provide support and resources, right? So community can lead direction, but government's responsible for the infrastructure. Government's responsible for the backbone, to make the machines move forward and go, and provide resources that help support community determined and driven outcomes. I think Evanston is an incredible example. Asheville is an incredible example. We also have cautionary tales in other places that have been so impactful in looking at, okay, so that might not be a direction that we want to go. We recently had a conversation about eligibility with the advisory council, and because of lessons that have been learned in other places, rather than going down the path of who should be eligible for repair, we were able to pivot and start down the path of what harm are we trying to address. And that's something that would not have that conversation would not have been possible without the lessons that we have gotten, and the benefits we've received from other places. I think about the task force in the state of California and how they very intentionally designed their report to be applicable to California and explicitly identifies California impacts, but looked at their process as the federal government has not engaged in this level of study and report, and we want to create a tool that is useful, for any government entity across the country that is doing this work. And they produced a report that we are now able to use in Michigan so that we don't have to recreate the wheel in terms of data collection, analysis, and fact finding. There's still, of course, work that has to be done, to make sure that our impacts and what we're addressing fit our local narrative. But those kinds of pieces, where areas that have more investment and have more resources are able to share that broadly, I think is really impactful.
Thank you. The word repair and reparations, I know, means something to you, but I suspect our listeners would be aided by your own definition. So, as the advisory council is going about its work, how is it defining reparations or repair?
So that is a excellent question, because that's one of the things that we are navigating right now. I can give you the perspective that I have, but my perspective is not speaking on behalf of our advisory council. So I want to be clear about that. I subscribe to the framework of the United Nations human rights definition around reparations, and repair, addressing the harm that has happened, ensuring that, you have a process that centers the voices of the impacted, and ensuring that whatever solutions are brought forward, explicitly and very intentionally prevent the reoccurrence of harm. I think that is, and I'm simplifying the UN definition, but I think that's the framework that I personally work from. I predict that our advisory council will adopt this as their framework as well. But I think that's also the beauty of working in community, is that community gets to define what that means. I would say that broadly in reparation spaces, human rights as the center, prevention of reoccurrence of harm, and addressing, the concerns of those who've been most impacted. That's what we're seeing from a national lens.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I know in some cases people start with acknowledgement and apology, with the imaginings. Once you've said, I recognize there was harm, I apologize for the harm, and that the hands are all wiped and we're all done. And I know you don't support that definition, so I'm glad you were able to articulate a little bit.
Well, I think I'm sorry that I harmed you, but I'm not going to do anything to repair the harm that I've done to you. Feels hollow to me, right? Especially when looking at, what we are trying to repair. Slavery was an economic system, right? And people are continuing to benefit and continuing to be harmed by the structure. Mass incarceration, Jim Crow, black codes, all of these things had very tangible have very tangible economic impacts. I think an apology about the harm that's been done absolutely, is necessary. Acknowledgement that harm has been done absolutely is necessary. And also, when we're talking about addressing systemic inequities, and we're talking about, prevention of reoccurrence, that also means that we have to do the things that tangibly and materially fix the harms that have occurred.
As we both appreciate, the political winds can blow in both directions, sometimes at the same time. And as we've seen over the last 18 to 24 months, we're coming out of 2020, they were blowing in favor of racial justice. And the last 18 months or so, there's been this anti DNI pushback at one level, anti ESG efforts at another level. So, what steps have you and your office and the advisory council taken to make sure that this exploration of reparations is itself more sustainable?
Avoidance of single point of failure system or person dependent systems. Part of the reason that the exploratory committee made the determination that the body should become a public body of the board was to help protect the work. A lot of the work currently lives inside of my office. And I tell people jokingly, but it's the truth. We're a team in total of 3 people in an office plant. And that's the largest that my team has been the entire time I've been with the county. And in addition to working on reparations, my team is also responsible for administration and oversight of our ARPA funds, our American Rescue Plan funds, which is a huge undertaking. I think it is. I'm grateful that the work lives inside of equity because that's definitely impacted how our county has distributed and dispersed the funding. But one of the ways I think that this work, reparations, DEI work, becomes destabilized is that you have concentrations of effort with too few people. Folks get stretched thin, burnt out, and leave. And so, planning around effective succession planning, ensuring that the institutional knowledge is not just held by one person, making use of external community partnerships, like with the Center for Social Solutions, um, making sure that we are spreading the work out in terms of community engagement are all ways in which we can protect the work as much as possible. That being said, the attacks are real. Earlier today, I was subject personally to a hit piece by a right wing blogger. And in that communication, there was information about my family that was partially doxxed. I think all of those kinds of things are intentional in terms of destabilizing this work and these efforts. But fundamentally, I feel like the winds are shifting. And I am incredibly hopeful about the next generation of organizers and activists and government workers and folks inside of the academy and the folks who are in our classrooms teaching, because I see the sea change happening in real time. Uh, I think that what we have to do is continue the work, is to make sure that we are creating leadership pipelines, that we are passing along the institutional knowledge, that we are creating spaces of care within communities and places where people can rest, and ensuring that when folks are ready to step away or need to step away, there is someone who's been prepared to effectively step up into that space. And we need to just wait for the dinosaurs to die out because I am convinced, I believe in my core that we will be successful.
Thank you. Maybe in a sentence, no more than two. What do you say to a citizen who comes up to you and asks, "How do I get involved?"
Come to a meeting for the Advisory Council on Reparations and join a subcommittee. We would love to have you.
Alize, thank you. Thank you for being a part of today's conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. It is always a pleasure to talk with you.
That concludes our episode for today. Thank you for listening to The Merging Point with special guest Alize Asberry Payne. You can visit Washtenaw County website to learn more about how you can attend meetings and get involved with the Advisory Council on Reparations. If you want to stay updated on The Merging Point, be sure to subscribe and don't forget to leave a review and share your thoughts. We want to hear from you, our listeners. For exclusive behind the scenes content about our work at the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions, be sure to follow us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We'll be back soon with another exciting episode. Until then, thanks for listening.